Welcome to the Nordic Venture Show, your speed date with the hottest Nordic innovations and ventures. In this episode, our venture date is with Paptic, sustainable wood, fibre packaging solutions.
Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. We'd love to get into the details, and today we're looking at something I think we can all relate to, something we see literally every single day, packaging.
Yeah. You can't go anywhere without seeing it. It's everywhere.
It really is. But what's really cool about today's deep dive is we're not just looking at any old packaging. We're not just looking at cardboard boxes or plastic wrap. We're actually zeroing in on the world of sustainable packaging.
That's right. And I think, with the growing concern over, environmental impact, plastic waste, all of that, it's becoming a really hot topic. And this is right at the cutting edge.
It is. And specifically today, we're going to be focusing on one company that's been making some serious waves in the sustainable packaging space, a company called Paptic.
Yeah, I've been seeing their name pop up more and more. And what's great about this deep dive is we have some excellent source material to work with.
We do. We've got a collection of news articles and blog posts, all coming straight from Paptic themselves. So we're getting like that insider perspective, really seeing what they're up to, what their priorities are, what they're focusing on.
Direct from the source.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So think of this session as like your mission briefing, okay? Your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to really understand what Paptic is, what they're doing in the sustainable packaging game, and why it matters. Why should you care?
And I think that last part is so important. We're bombarded with information all the time. So why should we pay attention to Paptic specifically?
Exactly. So to kind of give you a little taste of what we're going to be digging into, we're seeing them doing a lot. They're joining these big industry groups. They're navigating all these new regulations coming out. They're even winning awards. And they're starting to collaborate with some seriously big name brands.
Yeah, it sounds like they're really making moves. So I'm curious to kind of break it all down.
Let's do it. So first things first, let's answer the basic question. What is Paptic? What are they all about?
Yeah, let's get back to basics.
So at their core, Paptic is a company that makes packaging materials. But here's the twist. Instead of relying on, the traditional plastics, they're doing things a bit differently. Their materials are actually based on wood fibers.
Interesting. So it's like a super advanced form of paper in a way.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. It's kind of like Paper 2.0, specifically designed to handle all the demands of packaging. And, they're not shying away from making bold claims. They're positioning themselves as this sustainable alternative to plastics in packaging.
Which, that's a big statement, especially these days when everyone's trying to move away from plastics.
Yeah, and what I find really intriguing is they're not trying to reinvent the wheel completely. They're not coming in with some crazy new technology that no one's ever heard of.
Yeah.
What we're seeing in the sources is they're actually focusing on combining the best of both worlds.
Yeah, that makes sense. You don't want to completely disrupt everything all at once.
Right. It's about finding that sweet spot. So they're aiming to match the performance, the strength, the flexibility, the things that we expect from traditional packaging, but they're doing it in a way that's designed to work with the infrastructure that companies already have.
So they're making it easier for companies to make that switch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the key phrases that keeps popping up in the sources is converting lines.
Converting lines. Now, for those of us who aren't packaging experts, what exactly does that mean?
So converting lines refer to all that machinery that companies use to, process and shape the packaging materials. So basically, Paptic is saying, hey, our materials can work with the machines you already have.
That's a huge selling point. For a business looking to make their operations more sustainable, if they don't have to go out and buy all new equipment, that's a big win.
Yeah, it removes a major barrier to entry. And when we look at the sources, they really go deep on the sustainability angle. And the credentials are pretty impressive.
Yeah, lay it on us.
Okay, so their materials are bio-based, which means they come from renewable sources like those wood fibers we were talking about. But they're also designed with the entire life cycle in mind. What happens to the packaging at the end.
That's important. It's not just about where the materials come from, but what happens after we're done using them.
Right. So Paptic materials are recyclable, reusable, and even biodegradable.
Wow. So they're checking all the boxes.
Yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive approach.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond just the materials themselves. Paptic talks a lot about how they're trying to minimize their environmental footprint. during every step of the process.
So they're thinking about the sourcing of their materials, the manufacturing process, the whole shebang.
They really are. They talk about responsible sourcing of raw materials, being efficient in their operations. It's not just lip service. They're putting it into practice.
And I see here they actually have these 6 core pillars that they've defined that kind of sum up their whole philosophy.
Yeah, they're all about the circular economy. Renewable raw materials, reusability, recyclability, biodegradability, and resource efficiency.
So they're not just saying, hey, we're sustainable. They're actually breaking it down and showing you exactly how.
Transparency is key.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really smart move on their part. It builds trust. It shows they're serious about it.
Absolutely. And one thing I'm really curious about is what they've been up to lately. The sources we have are all fairly recent, so it would be great to get a sense of what they're actively working on.
Definitely. So one of the big things that jumped out at me was that in January 2025, they joined EDANA.
EDANA. Now, I have to admit, I'm not familiar with that acronym. What is that all about?
So EDANA stands for the European Disposables and Non-Wovens Association. It might sound a little niche, but it's a really influential organization in the world of, disposable products and non-wovens.
Well, diapers, wipes, things like that.
Exactly. And they're all about driving innovation and promoting sustainability within that sector. So for Paptic to join them, it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it shows they're really serious about making an impact in that specific area.
And it's not just about, being a member. It's about having a seat at the table where all the big decisions are being made about standards and best practices for the whole industry.
So they're not just innovating on their own. They're actually trying to shape the industry as a whole.
Exactly. And another really interesting point is that for the second year in a row, in 2024, they were recognized in Deloitte Finland's technology Fast 50.
Now, I know that's a big deal. It's a pretty prestigious award, isn't it?
It is. It basically highlights companies that are experiencing really rapid growth and are doing some seriously innovative things with technology. So for them to be recognized 2 years in a row, that's a pretty strong indication that they're onto something.
And it's not just any kind of technology. It's technology that's specifically aimed at addressing environmental challenges, which is even more impressive.
It shows they're not just chasing profits, they're trying to make a real difference.
And speaking of chasing things, they also managed to secure a pretty hefty chunk of funding in 2023, right?
They did. They closed a growth financing round and raised 27.5 million euros.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
It is. And that kind of investment speaks volumes about the confidence that investors have in Paptic's potential.
Yeah, they clearly believe that this company is going places.
They do. And that funding is going to be crucial for them to, scale up their operations, expand their reach, and really start to serve a global market.
So they're not just thinking small, they've got big ambitions.
And they need the resources to match.
Yeah.
Now, one other area that the sources touch on that I think is super relevant is the whole regulatory landscape for packaging, especially in Europe.
Yeah, the European Union is always at the forefront of these kinds of things, right?
They are. And one of the big things that's been happening is the packaging and packaging waste regulation, or the PPWR.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. It's a pretty major piece of legislation, isn't it?
It is. The European Parliament officially approved the final text in November 2024. And it's basically setting out all these new rules for packaging to make it more sustainable throughout its entire life cycle.
So it's not just about what the packaging is made of, but how it's produced, how it's used, how it's disposed of, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that the sources highlight how Paptic is really focusing on aligning themselves with these new regulations.
So they're being proactive. They're not waiting for the rules to come into effect and then scrambling to catch up.
They're getting ahead of the game.
Yeah.
And while the sources don't go into like a super detailed breakdown of how their materials meet every single requirement of the PPWR, the fact that they're emphasizing this alignment suggests that they're taking it seriously.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, hey, we're already on board with these new standards. We're building them into our products from the ground up.
Exactly. So it's not just about ticking boxes. It's about a genuine commitment to sustainability.
Now, I'm really curious to see how all of this translates into actual products. How are these Paptic materials actually being used out there in the real world?
Yeah, let's get down to brass tacks. And the sources actually give us some really cool examples of how their materials are being applied across a bunch of different industries.
Lay it on us.
Okay, so one area where they're making some serious inroads is the hygiene and feminine care sector.
So we're talking about products like diapers, sanitary pads, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And, traditionally, a lot of the packaging for these products has been heavily reliant on plastics.
Yeah, which is kind of ironic when you think about it, because these are products that are often, designed for single use, and then they end up in landfills.
It is a bit of a paradox.
Yeah.
But Paptic has developed this new wood fiber-based material that's specifically designed to replace the plastics in these types of products.
So they're not just trying to, make a slightly better version of plastic packaging. They're actually trying to replace it altogether.
And they're not just focused on the sustainability aspect either. They're also thinking about how easy it is for companies to actually use these materials.
That's the convertibility aspect we were talking about earlier, right?
Exactly. They want to make sure that their materials can run on existing packaging machinery, so companies don't have to make huge investments to switch over.
Makes sense. And they're also talking about improving the user experience, which is interesting.
Yeah, they're not just thinking about the environmental impact. They're also thinking about how the packaging feels, how it looks, the whole consumer experience.
So it's about finding that balance between sustainability and functionality.
Exactly. And given the sheer volume of packaging that's used in the hygiene and feminine care industry, if Paptic can really gain a foothold there, that could have a massive impact.
Yeah, that's a huge market with a lot of potential for positive change.
Now, another really exciting example is their collaboration with Iceland Foods.
Iceland Foods. Now, that's a name I recognize. They're a big supermarket chain in the UK, right?
They are. And they've actually launched a new generation of their carrier bags. And guess what? They're made entirely from Paptic's material.
Wow, so they've gone all in on this.
They have. And it's not just a small trial or anything like that. They've rolled these bags out across all of their Iceland and food warehouse stores.
That's a pretty strong statement.
It is.
Yeah.
And these aren't your flimsy, single-use plastic bags either. These bags are described as being strong, lightweight, reusable, and even moisture resistant.
So they've got all the benefits of a traditional plastic bag, but they're made from sustainable materials.
Exactly. And Iceland Foods themselves are really emphasizing the innovative nature of these bags. They're not hiding it. They're actually promoting it.
Which is great.
Yeah.
It's one thing for a company to quietly make a change, but when they're actively promoting their sustainable choices, that sends a really strong message.
Yeah, it shows they're proud of it.
Yeah.
And for a major retailer like Iceland to make that kind of commitment, it's a pretty big deal.
It's a sign that things are really starting to shift.
Now, we also see some other interesting examples in the sources of how companies are trying out and adopting Paptic materials.
Tell me more.
Okay, so there's Liz Grierson, the packaging quality manager at N. Brown.
N. Brown. They're a pretty big retailer, aren't they?
They are. They've got a bunch of different brands under their umbrella. And Liz mentions that they've actually trialed using Paptic material as part of their efforts to meet their ESG commitments.
ESG, so that's environmental, social, and governance.
Exactly. It's basically a framework that companies are using to measure their impact on the world.
Yeah.
It's all about being more sustainable and ethical.
So it's becoming a really important factor for businesses these days.
It is. And N. Brown specifically mentions that they're trying to reduce the amount of plastic waste that's generated from their e-commerce packaging.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Online shopping has exploded in recent years, and all those packages have to go somewhere.
Right. And they're also talking about wanting to improve the experience for their customers.
So again, it's about finding that sweet spot between sustainability and functionality.
Exactly. And then we have Banbury, which is a company that works in the textile sector.
So fabrics, bedding, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And they're actually quite open about the fact that packaging is a major sustainability challenge for their industry.
Which is interesting, because you wouldn't necessarily think of textiles as being a huge source of packaging waste.
Right. But they're actually quite proactive about wanting to find better solutions. And while they don't specifically say that they're using Paptic materials, the fact that they're actively looking for more sustainable options is a sign of the times.
Yeah, it shows that this is becoming a top priority for businesses across a wide range of sectors.
And it's not just the big corporations either. We also see examples of smaller companies making the switch.
Like who?
So there's Fisher Technic, which you might know them for their construction sets.
Oh, yeah. I loved those as a kid.
They're awesome.
Yeah.
And they're actually now using Paptic material for the pouches in their bio-based construction sets.
So they're replacing the traditional plastic pouches.
Exactly. And that's really cool because it shows that these sustainable alternatives are becoming more accessible, even for companies that are producing more specialized products.
And it's not just about toys either. We also see examples in the food industry.
Yeah, Phaser, which is a big confectionery company.
So chocolate candy, all that good stuff.
Yeah, they're actually moving away from plastic packaging for their candy bags, and they're using Paptic as an alternative.
That's a big deal. Those little candy bags, they generate a lot of waste.
They do. So it's great to see companies like Phaser taking steps to reduce their impact.
So it seems like Paptic is really making its way into all sorts of different products and industries.
They are. And another thing that caught my eye is that they participated in packaging Premier Milan in May 2024.
Packaging Premier Milan. Now, that sounds like a pretty big event.
It is. It's one of the major industry events for the packaging world. So the fact that Paptic was there showcasing their materials, that's a pretty clear sign that they're actively engaging with the industry.
Yeah, it's all about networking, making connections, finding new partners and customers.
Yeah, exactly. Now, one other thing that the sources mention, and I think this is really important, is that Paptic doesn't just have like one magic material that they're trying to sell to everyone. They actually have a portfolio of different material types.
Oh, that's interesting. So they've got options.
They do. They talk about Paptic sternopaptic and Paptic tetringa. And while the sources don't really go into a ton of detail about the specific properties of each one, the fact that they have this range tells us that they're able to tailor their materials to meet different needs.
So like different strengths, different levels of flexibility, maybe some are better for certain types of products.
Exactly. It's not one size fits all. And that's a really smart move on their part because it allows them to address a much wider range of applications and industries.
So they're not just trying to be a niche player. They're really trying to become a major force in the sustainable packaging world.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, what are your big takeaways from all of this?
You know, for me, it's really encouraging to see that the shift towards more sustainable packaging is not just some far-off dream. It's actually happening right now.
It is, and we're seeing companies like Paptic really leading the charge.
And they're not just talking about it, they're actually putting it into practice.
Exactly. And what's really exciting is that they're gaining traction. They're working with big-name brands. They're aligning themselves with these new regulations. It feels like they're building some serious momentum.
And, you know, the fact that they're focusing on using renewable resources like those wood fibers we talked about, and they're so committed to recyclability, reusability, biodegradability, all of that, it really speaks to the growing concern over plastic waste and the need for better solutions.
It does. And for me, it really highlights the power of innovation. You know, material science is playing a crucial role in this whole transition towards a more circular and sustainable economy.
Absolutely. It's not just about changing our behaviors. It's also about developing new technologies and materials that can help us reduce our impact on the planet.
So to kind of bring it all together, it's pretty clear that Paptic is a company to watch. They're making waves, they're innovating, they're collaborating, and they're really pushing the boundaries of what's possible in the world of sustainable packaging.
And it's inspiring to see that kind of vision and commitment.
It is. So as we leave you with something to ponder, what do you think about this? If we're seeing wood fiber-based packaging successfully replacing plastics in so many different areas, what other industries might be on the verge of similar transformation?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, it makes you wonder what other materials and technologies are out there that could help us create a more sustainable future.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to remember that we as consumers have a role to play in all of this.
Absolutely. You know, we can support companies that are making sustainable choices. We can make informed decisions about the products we buy and the packaging they come in.
It's about thinking beyond the initial convenience and considering the entire life cycle of a product, from production to disposal.
Yeah, and recognizing that our choices have an impact.
They do. So let's all do our part to make a difference.
To a more sustainable future.
Cheers to that.
Thanks for listening to the Nordic Venture Show. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more stories of innovation from the Nordics.